The first step to get started with Formly is to actually install it. So let's go over to the main website, which is formly.dev. This is the main place where you get all of the documentation. You can find a page dedicated for examples, with running examples even on StackBlitz and so on. So that's definitely the way to go for if you want to get deeper into Formly. Now to install, we can actually scroll the main page, which is basically a visualization of the README, and get to know how to install it. Like you can see here the different kind of examples. Like you obviously have to have Angular Forms, and then you install it Formly core. Now Formly usually comes in two different parts. There is that core part, which contains mainly basically the core functionality that Formly provides us. And then there comes a bundled UI theme. And the UI theme here, you can see these are the ones that are already included, which is Bootstrap, Material, Ionic, PrimeNG, Kendo, and even NativeScript. And there are more coming later as Formly evolves. Now we don't want to set this up manually as is described here, but rather what we want to do is to use the Angular CLI and the built-in Angular schematics. So we want to use that automated way of setting up our project. And we also want to use the UI theme Material, as that's what we are using in our project. So let's simply copy that, go back to our application, and let's paste that in. All right, so once we got Formly installed, let's have a look what happened. So you can see mainly the main app module has been modified. And what Formly did is actually set up the reactive forms module, which we'll need. Since Formly is based on top of the reactive forms module in Angular, then it installed the for root part, so the main Formly module here, as well as the Formly Material module, which provides the whole UI theming support for Material in our case. So with that, you're ready to use Formly in your project. So now that we have Formly installed, let's configure it and set up some first form. First of all, Formly is based on the reactive forms module, so we can just create a plain normal form. And let's also create here a form group, just as you're accustomed with reactive Angular forms. Let's also use an ng submit here and immediately set it up. And we pass in here the form. Now, obviously, we have also to go into our app component and create those parts also there. So we have to create here the form. Let's create here a new form group. And we don't pass any controls inside here, but we just provide here an empty form group. Also, let's define it and on the submit. And we get here the valid and value with structure directly. And then let's console log that out. All right, so with that, we have basically created a new reactive form. Now comes the special part that makes up Formly. So instead of creating here the different kind of form controls in our HTML file and then link them up into our corresponding reactive form controls that we define in our component, what we do here is we use that Formly form component. And this is something that came when we installed Formly into our project. And that Formly form component has different kind of properties. First of all, it has a model. Now let's directly link this. Obviously, we have to define this model property later in our component class. But for a second, let's just reference it here. Next one is the fields. And the fields are needed by Formly in order to generate dynamically all those form controls. And we will see them in a minute. So again, let's just reference them. And then we pass in the actual form that Formly should hook onto itself. All right, now we need to define these three parts also in our component code. And so first of all, we have to create the model. Now the model is actually nothing else than our data model. Now for now, let's simply create an empty one here, but this will be the part that you would normally fetch from some server-side API or from some NGRX store or wherever you have your model that you want to display on the form. Next are the fields. And these fields are, as we mentioned, the so-called Formly field config parts. And that's where Formly defines how the form should actually look like. And that's exactly what we are going to define now. So as a first step, let's create a simple import form. And assume that in the model here, we model here a person object. And so we would have probably something like first name. Let's add here Yuri. Let's also add some age, 34, and so on. For now, let's stick to with these two. Now, assume we want to create an import form for our first name property. And so we go here down here into the formally form config, and then this kind of configuration has a special syntax, of course, which we can look up on the formally.dev website. So what it consists of is first of all the key, and the key matches the property in our model. So here, for instance, I'm telling formally data bind the first name, and so we'll like automatically hook up into that first name property up here. Next, I'm telling it what type of form control do I want to render on my page, and that's an input type. And finally, we give it some options, which is defined in those template options. And these allow me to customize further how my input form should look like. And so in this case, it's simply of type text. So we want to have an input type text. Now, since text is the default, we don't actually have to write it, but I want to write definitely the label. In this case, it's first name. All right, so let's save this. And now, as you can see already in our form here on the side, we already get here an input field. It's first name. It already data binds Yuri, and we can write in, and it's just a normal Angular material input field. Now let's add some debug component here, which I have already in this project. Let's add it directly below here. And what this debug component does, it gets the form value and the model itself. And so this will help us visualize what actually is going on our form. For instance, in this case, if I open it up, you can see the form value. And the form value is already data bound, and you can see it live updates whenever I change the form controls value here. And this is the model which actually maps onto that model property which we have defined here. And in fact, you see here we have the first name as well as the age property, which we didn't yet map on our form control and our form, and therefore we don't see it in the form value here. The interesting part here with Formly is that it doesn't only live update the actual form value, but also the model. And so we can directly bind the model into it and send it back to the server, even if we're only mapping a subset of it, such as the first name in this case. Let me also quickly add here the submit buttons. So we add them within our form here. And we have a reset button here as well as the normal submit button. And so now if we open up the DevTools console, let's click the submit button here, we can actually see that the actual submit also works just as we expect. So far we have only mapped the first property, which is here the first name property. And this is a pretty simple, or probably the most simplest form configuration with Formly. So we have just form binding, we have input type input, and we default it to input type text. Now let's say we want to map also that age property. So what I could do here, of course, is just copy and paste this, change here the property name, and of course also the label, save this, and we will get automatically also that age property data bound. Now, something I probably don't want is to be able to input here characters on that age field. And so a very simple thing we could do here is to change from input type text, which is the default, to input type number. And the only thing I have to do here is to go to that template options and further customize how my form control should look like. And by changing it to number, you can now see that if I go to that form here, you can see those little arrows on the side. And so with those arrows, I can basically control the number that's incrementing or decrementing. And if I place my cursor in here and try to type some characters, it won't work because they are not allowed to be entered into these fields. And this is basically how you customize your input controls. Now, so far we have mapped our first two properties here. Now let's assume a bit more complicated use case. For instance, every person probably belongs or has been born in a specific nation. So what we have here is usually a nation ID, let's say 2, which points to the ID of the nation the actual person was born in. And so that's usually represented by some kind of drop-down field. Now let's go and create one below here. Again, that will map to nation ID, the property we just defined on our model. Then the type here now is no more input, but a select actually. Because what we want to actually create is a select box, which has a tag select here. Now, in the template options, we again specify our label. That would now be nation. And let's save this for now. And so with that, we get here that nation drop-down field visualized on our form. Now, the problem right now here is that we don't have any kind of options to choose from. And so in order to do so, we can specify them in the template options here. So what I could do here is I create this options field, which is an array, which usually consists of a value, which would be the ID, for instance 1, and then the actual label. And that could be like Germany, and here let's do value 2, which is label, Italy, and so on. Now the application refresh, as you can see now, Italy has actually been pre-selected. And the reason is now our drop-down field is actually already being recognized. I have here value 2 for Italy in my options list, as well as the value that is data bound on my model is 2. So therefore Italy is already pre-selected correctly. And you can see I can open it and I can select a different one, and this will get reflected then on my form value as well as on my model, just as we would expect. Now obviously hard coding these values here in our form configuration is usually not an option we can go for. In real world applications here we would have a lot more, and moreover those values usually come from a server side. So in order to emulate that, let's create a new service, ngg service, and let's call it data service. Now if you open up our data service, let's create here a function get nations, which returns us a set of nations, which we can then data bind onto our drop-down field. And in order to have this as similar as possible to an actual HTTP call, let's return here an observable, and I'm using here that off function. So let's import that, and let me paste in here just a set of nations, so we can save this. And now let's go back into our app component. First of all, we obviously have to import that nation service into our constructor. So let's place the constructor down here. We have here the data service. And now we can actually go and use those nations that are returned from the data service. Now the interesting part here is that options property here informally does not only accept here an array, but we can directly hook it to an actual observable. And so what we can do here is we can say this is data service dot get nations, and formally will automatically recognize this is an actual observable. It will subscribe to it, and once the value resolves, it will actually bind and visualize them on the form. So let's refresh here again. You can see now Germany has been selected because here the second one is Germany. Let's switch to one, which in our data service is Italy. And you can see it correctly gets reflected, as well as the different kind of values get pre-filled as we expect from our service. So in order to be able to further customize the behavior of our form controls here, of our formally form controls at runtime, Formally has the concept of so-called hooks. Now let's have a look how they work. Now if you open up here the definitions, you can see here these are of types Formally lifecycle options. And what they consist of is of callback functions, which are very similar to the one that actual Angular components also have. Now let's have a look how that works. Let's for instance use the onInit lifecycle hook. What we get here is as a parameter in the callback function we have the field configuration. So this is a Formally field config type. And now inside here we can actually go and inspect how our field looks like. First of all, we can go to field. We can for instance dynamically set the template options. I could change here the label to first name changed, just to see the effect here of our Formally onInit lifecycle hook. Now you can see the first name changed label here appears and no more the one that we actually originally specified here. And this is a very powerful way to here, for instance, issue some server-side call and based on the server-side call further customize your input form. You also have access here to the actual model as well as to the actual form. And especially access to the form and the form control gives us a lot of power, because once we use that form here and the according form controls, we are actually back in reactive forms land. And so what we can easily do here is to, for instance, grab other instances of fields, like for instance the age field, and register on its value changes event. And from that, elaborate and continue as we need in our specific use case. Now assume our model here has another property, city ID. For now, let's also use the ID 1. And let's also go to our data service and create a new getCities method, similar to our getNations. just that in this case, we also want to be able to give it a nation ID and filter that cities based on that nation ID. So the nation ID will be of type number. Let's say by default is null. And again, we will return here an observable of type of. For now, we can remove here the actual typization, and let's save this now. As you can see, we have a similar array structure as we have for the nation. So we have always a value in the label. The only difference is that we also have a nation ID, which then allows us to filter that array based on the nation ID which we have maybe passed as a parameter. Now again, this is just for the purpose of this demo application. In a real world scenario, this will probably be a server-side call where you pass along the nation ID. The server will then filter the database based on that nation ID and return the new set of cities. So let's go back to our app component. Let's here for now copy our nation ID and create a new drop-down field that now maps to the city ID. And here we would have the get cities for now. So you can now see we have here Italy, which is the nations, and also the different kind of cities. Now, in a real world scenario, these cities might be a long list of cities. So definitely we want to filter them based on our nation. So here, let's correct this label. Whenever someone changes basically that nation, we want to filter that city's drop-down field based on the value that has been chosen up here. And so one possibility to do so is to actually not directly create here that observable, but rather let's place here an empty array and use the so-called lifecycle hooks which you have seen before. And so we want to use the onInit, and we get here a formally field config. And so inside there, we can now get access to the form, which is now an Angular reactive form. And therefore what we can do here is we can get hold of that nation ID property. Now that nation ID points to the form control created by this formally form config. So this points to the underlying reactive form control. And so we can use the value changes stream here and go and register that and manipulate it. And so what we want to do in our specific case is we want to use here a switch map. So let's quickly import that from RxJS operators. And so with that switch map, what we get here is the nation ID value. And we want then to pass that along to our data service, which returns an observable again, and give that to the nation ID. As a result from that switch map, we now get back basically the observable of cities. And so those cities we want to actually associate to our template options, to that basically empty array right now. And so we can directly go to that field.templateOptions.options and associate the result to that one. So now what you can see is that if I click here to Germany, for instance, and I open up the cities, I just see German cities. If I go to Italy, I just see Italian cities. Now there's one caveat we have to still fix. So if we refresh, initially we don't see any value. And that's because we have to use here the starts with operator from RxJS and pass in our model's initial value. And so that will be the this.model.nationID. We also need to import that from the RxJS operators. Now let's save again. And you can see now that correctly our city gets pre-filled. So in our formally form here, we have these two dependent selects. So whenever I choose, for instance, Germany, I only will get German cities. Now there's one thing, whenever I remove here the nation, I can still choose all of the cities. And this is something I don't want to have. Like what I would like to have is whenever I remove the value of the nation, it doesn't make sense to be able to choose any kind of city. And so therefore I want to disable that city's control here. Now in Formally, we can disable fields by simply going to the template options, and there's a disabled property and we can set that to true. Now as you can see, these cities are disabled. But what we want to do is obviously to make them disabled depending on whether the nation has been chosen or not. So we could definitely make use of that onInit lifecycle hook here and hook into that observable stream and check whenever that nation ID that comes in here basically from that observable stream is null, we then create a side effect and disable the form field by dynamically manipulating the template options. But that's not something we want to do in this lesson here. Rather, we want to make use of another property of Formly, which are expression properties. Now, expression properties are dynamically evaluated expressions that allow us to set properties of our Formly field. And in this case, we want, for instance, to set the template options.disabled property. So we dynamically want to set this one here. And we want to set that based on the model's value. And so these expression properties, if we jump into the definition, we can first of all define them as a string or as a callback function where we get as a parameter the model, the form state, and the actual field configuration. Now in our case, let's simply use that callback. Let's grab here the model, and let's say whenever the model.nationID is not defined, this should actually be disabled. And so we can again remove here our static definition. Now let's see whether that works. So if I remove here the nation, you can see the cities gets disabled. If I again choose a nation, we again get the city enabled and filtered properly, just as we expected. Now in this example here, whenever we change here the nation and reset it to a null value, our cities box here gets disabled. And what happens in that case is that in the form value, we get nation ID null and we get the city's ID not displayed at all, which is actually what we want. In many cases, however, we want to send back and deal only with the model. So we want to have that model be sent back and synchronized with our form, which is totally the case. Whenever we change here our form, our model value gets updated just as we want. However, in this specific case, you can see the city ID still remains 1, which is the value currently displayed in that city dropdown field. Now we definitely want to reset that. And one way to reset again here is to manipulate here that observable stream that listens on that nation ID property. And whenever that is null with a tab or something, we could actually reset our model. So we could here use the tab operator and then change the model value. Another very elegant approach here is again to use expression properties. Expression properties, as we learned, don't only allow us to set here template options and different kind of configurations of our form field, but surprisingly, we can also actually set properties of our model. So we can set here model.setID, and instead of using the callback, which we could totally do, let's use the string expression form in this case. And so whenever we don't have a nation ID, we want to set the model city ID to null. And otherwise, we just want to keep this current city ID which we have chosen. So let's see whether that works. Let's go to our model tab. Right now we have nation ID 1, city ID 1. If I remove the nation ID, you can see that both values get reset as we intend. Now the difference here between using the string value and the actual callback is just an aesthetics point of view. So we could easily also here use the callback function as we did here in the disabled case. This is just another form of using expression properties in Formly. So whenever we pass a string, Formly will recognize that, evaluate that string at runtime, and actually execute it against what we defined here in front of that string. In this case, by setting the model city ID. So in this case of our form here, we have these two dependent fields, and whenever I basically set this to null, this gets disabled. Now we maybe not only want to disable it, but we want to directly hide it from the user. So similarly as for the disabled property where we use the expression properties here, we can do something similar for the hidden property of a form control. The only difference there is we get a different kind of expression, which is the hide expression. Now this is subject to be changed, so future versions might migrate this hide expression into the expression properties since it fulfills a very similar purpose. But for now we can use the hide expression again. And we have different kind of possibilities, so we can say whenever the model.nationID is not given, we actually hide the form. And so we can see here whenever I change this and remove this here, you can see the cities select box gets removed and is no more visible. And again, also here we can use that string expression, or we could use the normal model callback and say simply model.nationID, just as we did here above with the disabled property. And that will work in the very same manner. Again, here you can see the cities dropdown gets hidden. Now, one thing that is very comfortable about Formally is that it actually data binds also the model value. And so, for instance, in a form where we have multiple properties, but we only map a subset of them, we can actually use the model to send them all the properties back to the server again. For instance, assume that we loaded the model from the server and we probably have some primary key here. Now, usually the primary key is not part of my form values because I don't actually create a form control for that primary key and visualize it on the form. So rather what I usually do is I bind the form controls I want to change, for instance, the first name, age, and so on. And my model is actually always up to date. Whenever I change here the nation, you can see the nation here gets data bound immediately. And in that way, I always have the entire model and I can directly send it back to the server on the onSubmit event. A different approach is to actually place the ID also in the form value and then use the form value to post back to the server. This can be easily achieved by directly going to the field configuration and create a so-called hidden field. And the only thing I'm binding here is the actual ID property. I don't specify any type or template options because that field should not be visible. And so if I change that and save it, and if I go now to my form value, you can see that the actual ID gets data bound, but it is not visible here on that form directly. So form validation is an integral part of every real world form. And so even in this case here in our example, what we would like to have, for instance, is whenever I remove that first name value, that the user gets some message that this field is required. Now in Formally there are already some built-in validators, and we can simply activate them by going to the template options of the corresponding field, in this case our first name, and here entering required true, for instance. As a result, what you can see is we get this star beneath our first name label, which already indicates to the user this field is required. And even more, if I remove here the value, you can see that it gets red. Now there's another thing which we definitely want to do. We want to obviously provide some message to the user. And so what we can do here is we go to the corresponding module where we have defined our Formally module for root. And this Formally module for root takes an object with some additional configuration. And one of them is the validation messages. And so inside here, we can provide an array for messages that are globally valid. So they're not specific to a given field on a given form, but they are generally true for our entire application. And this is definitely the case for a required validator. And for instance, what we have to do here is we have to tell Formally what kind of validator this message should be activated for. And then we give it the message. And in this case, let's simply say this field is required. Now, if I go back here and I remove here again that value, you can see that the validation message gets properly displayed just below our field. So in this form here, we have already a required validator on our first name, and we have defined it here in our template options of the corresponding field configuration. And we defined the message here in our app module where we have our Formally module for root registration. Now let's provide some more sophisticated message. For instance, here in our age property, we want to specify the min validator, and we define 18 as the minimum allowed value. And whenever the user now has a value below 18, we want to provide him a more sophisticated message indicating what's the minimum allowed value, such that he can correct his value and proceed in the form. And so again, let's go to our app module. And just as we did here for the required validator, let's define another one. In this case, the min validator. And we provide here a message and the string for the message. Now, in this case, we don't actually define a string directly, but rather we define a function that allows us to further customize this message. And so at the very top here, we define a new function. Let's call it min validation message. And that gets an error. And it gets a field, and that's actually the Formally field configuration. For now, let's return here a simple message, error message, and let's also console log here the error and the field, such that we can see what actually the values are that Formally provides us. We also need to now hook up that min validation message below here. So rather than providing the string, we directly reference the function. Now let's go to the form, let's open up the DevTools. And now if I type in 12, you can see here the console log statements. And so the first parameter, the error, basically gives us the minimum allowed value, which we defined, and the actual value that has been provided. And the second one provides us actually the whole configuration of our input field. So we could directly also go here to the template options and read out here the min value that we specified. All right, so let's go back and customize this message now. And so what we could do here is we could provide here a template string. Please provide a value bigger than. And then here we could say error.min, because that's actually the value, the minimum value allowed. You provided error.actual. We can remove here the console log statements. Let's save again. Now again, let's provide here 12. Now you can see here, please provide a value bigger than 18, and you provided 12. As you can see, we can really provide some context. What we can also do is we can define this message as a general message that holds globally for our app. But in some specific case, we might even go here and override these messages. For instance, here we could say validation, and this has a property messages. And we could directly go and override here, for instance, the min validator and say, sorry, you have to be older than 18. This message actually overrides what we just defined globally. And so you can see now, sorry, you have to be older than 18, which has overridden the message which we provided here. And so that is a very powerful mechanism which allows you to define messages globally, but also to customize them at the very specific needs you might have in some dedicated forms on your app. So as we have seen, Formly has some built-in validators, such as the required validator here or the min validation. And this works quite well in many cases, but then there are some custom cases, some specific ones which you might encounter in your enterprise application where you definitely need a custom validator to be built. And Formly obviously supports that as well. Now, let's see how that works. And we actually have different kind of ways on how to hook up a custom validation. Now, I couldn't come up really with a good example, so let's assume here we have a field that contains an IP address. And we definitely want to add that here to our form as well. So let me just go to the very end and let me create here a new configuration, which is here for the field IP. It will be a normal input field. And in the template options, we just specify the label for now, IP address. All right, now, first of all, let's define the validation of such an IP address. So here I define a function for now directly in our component here, and I call it IP validator. And that validation function here gets the control, which is a form control from Angular reactive forms. As a result, what it returns is a validation error. And these are all classes directly coming from the Angular core packages. And so we are not too much interested here on how to implement the actual validation. So let me just paste in a validation for such an IP address. And what you can see here, I first of all return when the control doesn't have a value, because we want to validate only if we have actual value, because the validation of an empty field is the responsibility of a required validator. And so with that, the validator itself is already made. And we can go down to our field again. And first of all, we want to definitely have here a required validator as well, such that the user has to input some field. And then let's also add the validators, and we can directly do that here by using the validators property. And this takes an object, and then we have a validation array where we can actually then reference our function. And here we give it our IP validator. Now let's go here. Let's try some number. You can see it gets red. Let's try some valid IP. And the field is valid again. Now obviously we also have to define a message. And as we learn, we can define a message directly here in our app module, for instance. Let's create here a custom message. We get error and we get the field. And here let's return field.form control. We could directly go through the form control value. So to get the current value of our form control is not a valid IP address. Of course, we have to register that as well down here. So we have here the name IP, and the message would be our IP validation message. So again, if I enter here some value like this, you can see 1.3 is not a valid IP address. So this is one way of implementing our validator, by directly implementing it here in our component class and then referencing it directly on our field here below on our validators property. Another approach we could take is to make this a global validator. Since IP validation is quite a generic function, we could actually extract this here move it to a dedicated validation messages file or validators file. But right now, let's just place it here on top of our app module. So we implement here the validator. Let's import here the missing Angular classes. And then we register it here as a validator on our form module. And so we can just create here the validators property, which is very similar to what we did on our formerly field configuration. And this is an array. And it takes an object where we give it the name of the validator and the actual validation function, which will be IDP validator. So with that, we have defined our validator. Now we can go back to our app component and to our formerly field here. And rather than specifying it directly in this way, we can just provide here the string IP, which is the name of the validator which we just defined. And as you can see, if I now type in some characters, we again get the normal validation which we expect from our validator. But now it is defined as a global validator and can be reused on multiple forms within our app. Another way of defining validators is by directly using so-called expressions. And so instead of here referencing a validator which we have defined globally, we could provide just some ad hoc validation for a specific use case in our form. And so here I could give it a property called IP. Let's call it IP2 just to make sure we don't collapse with the one we already defined. And here I have the possibility to provide an expression, which gives me here a custom form control. And I pass directly the expression to validate that, which is exactly the one we used before. Also, I can directly provide here the message. And so that will give me the error. And it will also give me the formerly field config, just as we have seen in the other case before. And then I can provide here a message and say field.formControl.value, just as we did before, an example is not valid. And again, this works exactly as we would expect. Now you can see here the message is a little bit different than the one we defined before in our validation. That makes sure that we're actually using this one here inline in our form. So this is very powerful if you have a very simple validation just for a specific field in one of your forms. And so you can directly hook them up related to that field, and you don't have to define them globally in a different file. Now, so far we have seen some very built-in form controls that Formly gives us via these type declarations here, as well as the kind of customizations we might do in the template options. Now, of course, you might have different kind of controls. For instance, in the nation case here, we might have a lot of nations. Like in this example, I just have 3 of them, but assume there might be thousands of them, right? And so therefore, what we want to do definitely is maybe to provide some autocomplete here to the user rather than a normal drop-down functionality. I'm not going to write my autocomplete myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use ngselect. And so let's scroll down here to find the installation instructions. I'm using Yarn in this project, but you can definitely just use npm. Now, once we have ngselect installed, we need to do a couple of other steps in order to set it up properly. First of all, let's import here corresponding styles. And then we can go to our app module and register the ngselect module. Now, of course, you might do that wherever you want to include that ngselect. It might be in a shared module or, of course, also in your lazy loaded feature module where you use ngselect. For this purpose here, of this demo applications, I'm just registering everything here in the app module to keep it simple. All right, so with that, we should have ngselect set up. Now we need to actually integrate it with Formly such that we can actually go then to our nation ID and give it a different kind of type here. And as a result, Formly should use our ngselect rather than a normal drop-down field. So let's see how to do that. So in order to implement this, we need to create a custom Formly type. And for this demo application here, I'm just creating a file at the very root of my application. But of course, in a more real-world application, you might have a different kind of folder structure where you have all of your custom Formly controls. In this case, let's just call it ngselect type.ts for Formly type. And what this actually is just a normal plain component. So let's start with this placeholder here. I'm calling it Formly ngselect. Here we have our template. And in order to create a custom Formly type, the only thing we have to do is to extend from field type. And field type here comes from the Formly core again. And as the next step, let's create here the actual HTML of our component. Now, since this is material, we need to add here some couple of classes. So let me just add them here, which is mat input field and mat form field infix. These you can just look up on your auto material components, and so you can basically adjust your own custom components to the material design. Next, we use ngselect. And this is the component which we just installed by getting ngselect installed on our project. And the ngselect component takes a couple of properties here. First of all, it takes the items it should display. And this is via the items property. Now, if you go back to our nation property here, you can see basically the template options, and the options property is where the data gets passed in. Now, interestingly, inside those custom components via that field type, we can access the template options via the TO variable. And so we can just do to.options to actually get the options in. Now, in this case, let's say we by default just support observables, and so we need to use async pipe to pass that ahead. Similarly, we can add a placeholder, which is another property of ngselect. And again, here we would like to see basically the label being displayed. Another property here is the bind value. Now, normally the value property, so basically value, would be the default name of the property that should be displayed out of these options. And in this case, let's say we want to be able to customize it. So whenever the user provides a bind value property and provides us with a different property name, we will use that one. Otherwise, we just use value as the default. Finally, a very important part is the form control. Now, since these are custom form controls, we definitely need to pass that ahead. And here again, formally already sets up the form control in that field type, so we can just use that variable as we inherited here in our component and use it ahead. And the last thing which we have to do to make it complete is to add the isInvalid class whenever our component basically is invalid, and we can do that by the show error property. Now, with that, we have actually set up our custom component, our custom formally type. We now need to also register that, and so we go to the app module, and we go down here to that formally for root property, and here we should have a types property, which is an array, which allows us to pass in custom types. And so in this case here, let's call it my autocomplete, and the component which we would like to use whenever that type is being used is our ngselect formally component. Now, since this is a normal Angular component, we obviously also have to register it. So we have to go here to the declarations or wherever you register that component and pass it into that ng module. All right. Now the type should be defined. We can actually copy that and go over to our app component. And so instead here of that type select, we can now specify our custom type, which is my autocomplete. So you can already see here that the form control changed. So the styling is not perfect. So that's definitely something you would want to work on a real world application. By just adding some classes, we could adjust that. But you can see now we don't have a normal select anymore, but we have some additional functionality like that X, which clears the value. We can still select it just as we are accustomed, and the data binding will just work. But now we can also search something like Italy, and that's exactly what that autocomplete functionality gives us. So that's a very simple example of how you can basically embed a third-party component, wrap it into a formally configuration, and then use it within your formally configs. I highly suggest you to go to the formally.dev if you want to create more custom formally controls. Go to the GitHub repository. Inside there, go to the source folder and check out the different kind of form control implementations here. For instance, for material, you can just go inside there and check out, for instance, how a multi-checkbox is being implemented. So you can see here that multi-checkbox type, and you can exactly take a look how the author of Formally actually implements it and how he handles different kind of scenarios. So that's a great way to learn and further dig into creating custom Formally controls. So let's take a look at the following functionality. We want to be able to end-to-end test here our form, and we want to be able to grab the various form fields easily from within our end-to-end testing framework. Let's say we use Cypress. Cypress is a new emerging tool for doing some new kind of end-to-end testing. And in Cypress, in order to be able to easily grab a field on your form, what they suggest is to use so-called data attributes. And in Formally, we can add such various attributes by using here the attributes property. And inside here, we can just specify the attribute we want to add. For instance, with Cypress, there's a standard or naming convention which tells you add a data-cy property, because that will be picked up by Cypress easily. And what I usually do is then I use basically the property, the key here of my Formally field as a data-cy attribute on my Formally field. That allows us then to easily grab that field via CSS selector, because if you go to the inspection here of our HTML part, you can see here that data-cy property with first name. And so within my Cypress test, I know that there will be a data CI property, and I can just grab that via the actual data bound property. Now this is some kind of cross-cutting functionality because I want to add this by default on all of my formally field configurations. Now I can obviously go here and copy and paste them all over, but that would mess up my code and make it much more unreadable and cluttered. With Formally, we can implement something that's called extensions, and extensions are exactly for such cross-cutting functionalities. Again, I'm just creating here a new file at the very root of my project, but obviously you would create a different kind of directory. So let's call that datacy.extension. And so from the very first beginning here, it's just a normal function. So I can use here const datacy extension, and that returns a Formally extension. And we can already import that Formally extension here, and that will be imported from ngx Formally core. And so what that Formally extension gives us, it gives us a pre-populate, on-populate, and post-populate hook. And all of these get basically the Formally field configuration as a parameter, and so we can manipulate that accordingly. So let's, in our case, implement here the pre-populate, because that's one of the earliest one. And so we get here the field, this is the Formally field configuration. And so with that, we get here each field configuration of our form will be passed through this method. And now we can easily create that data CI attribute, right? And so here we could simply say field.template options equals to, and we want definitely to make sure that we don't lose our template options that are already specified, or basically just create a new one. And then we add our attributes and the data CI property. And here we can directly go to the field.key as the actual property. Now, in the more advanced scenarios, we want probably also to make sure that if someone already specified this part, we don't go and override it, because maybe someone wants to specify some particular key, which we don't want to override here. But for the simplicity of this example, let's just leave it as is. Now, we also need to register that, of course, with Formally, in order that Formally knows that it has to execute this extension. And we go here to our Formally configuration, and similarly as we have here for validators and validation messages and types, we also have another one which is called extensions. So we can just go here, extensions. This is an array again. It takes a name. Let's call it data CI extension. And then it actually takes an extension itself. And that's our extension which we just created. So this is the data CI extension. And obviously we need to import it as well. So let me just import that. And this is the data CI extension. Now let me go back to our app component and let me remove here our manually added extension again. And now if you go here, let's go to the age property, do inspect. Now you can see here how the data CI attribute has been added. So it has also been added here, for instance, on our first name property and all the other properties we have on our form. And this way you can implement such a cross-cutting functionality with a very simple function that you deploy centrally at one point, you register it there, and you can basically create very powerful mechanisms. So we have looked at Formally extensions mainly by adding a data CY property to all of our fields. And this extension is quite a simple one. Let's have a quick look. All we do there is basically to add something to the template options, in this case, a new attribute. Now let's assume we want to do something more complex. For instance, all of our labels on our form fields are right now just hard-coded in English. Now, obviously, in a more real-world application, you want to support multiple languages. One way to translate is, for instance, to use ngx translate. And I've actually already installed that to have the setup in place. And also in the app module, I have made sure to basically register here the translate module and as well to have here the assets deployed on my application. And right now I have a DE file which basically has the German translations for all of these form field labels. Now what we could definitely do is we could go now to our app component and we could say basically to import here the translate service, which I have already done. So here you can see I imported translate service. I set the default language to use DE, so German right now. And then if I go to my configuration up here, for instance, let's say the first name, I can use the expression properties and say template options.label, say this.translate.stream, which will return as an observable, and pass in here the first name key. Since in my de.json file I have here the key first name and the according translation in German, this should now work. And in fact, what you see here is now we have the key here, first name properly translated into German Vorname. Now again, this is something we don't want to do manually on each of our field configurations. Rather, this is a perfect example again for an extension. So let's implement that. Again, I create here a new file at the very root here. Let's call it translate.extension.ts. And now this extension here is a bit more complicated. While in the previous extension, we just returned a function, basically that implemented the pre-populate and post-populate hooks. In this case, we need to get access to the translate service. As we have seen here in our app component, we need to be able to inject that into the constructor of our class and then to use its translate.stream or translate.instant function to actually translate the key that we pass in. So in this example, we need actually a class because then we can basically have the injector inject the translate service into the class constructor. So let's call it translate extension. And as mentioned in the constructor here, we need to get access to the translate service. And so with that, we are set up in terms of having the translate service in place. Now we can go and implement the actual pre-populate hook. So again, the pre-populate gets here a field, and that's the formally field configuration. Pre-populate hook here is part of the formally extensions. And so inside here, we can now implement actual behavior. And so first of all, what we want to do is we want to, again, attach here the expression properties just as we have manually done before. We also want to make sure to pass in existing expression properties someone might have specified on here. Otherwise, we just created an empty one. And then we come to what we actually want to do. We want to set the label. So template options.label. And here we want to basically use our translate service. We want to use the stream method. And as a key, we just want to use the current label specified on the field configuration. So basically the one here on our first name, for instance, specified under the template options. So what we can do here is we can just go to field.templateoptions.label. Now something we might have to pay attention here is that the template options here might not be specified. And so we might run into the runtime error. Also, what we don't want to do is we want to repetitively translate existing labels. So that doesn't make sense. And so therefore, let's here elaborate a bit our example. So I'm here accessing here the template options. And so if they are not specified, let's just return an empty object. Another thing we definitely want to do here is to create some exit conditions. For instance, one of them is whenever the template options doesn't have a label defined, we definitely want to return, because without that label, we basically here don't have the minimum requirement in order to be able to perform the localization. Furthermore, I don't want to add these expression properties multiple times. So similarly, what I can do to the template options is to add some translated flag. And I'm just setting that to true. And then up here, I'm saying whenever that to.label is not defined, or I have already translated my formally expression here. And so let's save this. And with that, we have basically implemented the whole extension. Now what is left is we need to register that as well. Now in the previous example we made for the data CI extension, we have just used a simple function. That was enough. In this case, it's a bit different because we need to rely on the dependency injector to provide us the translate service. And so therefore we need to register our translate extensions in a different manner. Let's go back to the app module and scroll down to the very bottom. And so we need to register it here in the providers section because we need to rely on our dependency injection mechanism. And so this is another way formally allows us to register an extension. And so what we do is we use that formally config token here. It is multi-true because obviously we can register multiple extensions, and we need to use a factory. And let's first of all define the name of our factory function. We are going to implement that very soon. Let's call it register translate extension, and that has a dependency of the translate service. So let's import here the translate service again from translate core, and we need to define that register translate extension factory function. Now we can do that here in our app component, or we can also just append it here on our translate extension so that everything is basically bundled in the same file. And so let's create here a new function, register translate extension, and we need to get the translate service as a dependency. And here we just return an object, which is basically the registration of our extension. And so we get here the extensions, array just as we have in a module. And here it takes an object where the name is translate extension. And then the extension function itself is basically by creating a new translate extension object, basically the object class above here. And as a dependency, we now pass in the translate service. And so with that, we basically have created a new instance of our translate extension. Now let's go back because we need to import that, of course, here in our file. And with that, we should be ready to go. Now with that, you can see now all the labels are translated automatically by our extension, even though we don't have any kind of mechanism specified on our original Formly configurations. So even though you might be quite impressed how powerful Formly is, like with properties such as expression properties or hide expressions or how it deals with observables, but still you might think, well, these are examples that are quite simple. Like we always have a flat form, which is usually not what you have in a real enterprise application. Now I can tell you, I've created huge enterprise apps with Formly, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether this has been created with a normal reactive forms approach or with Formly. Now those forms are actually multi-column, as you might expect. So let's see how we can implement that. So there are definitely different kind of approaches we can take here. But the main reasoning behind is to apply classes to these elements and tell Formly how many fields go in a certain row and how many columns a certain field in our column-based layout will occupy. For instance, the first name might go over 3 columns, while the age is a smaller one, which might just occupy 1 column. Now, in our styles SCSS file, I have already pasted some kind of styles in here, as this is not really the scope of our video here. But what you can see here is we have the display flags class, which goes under the container of a single row. And then we have different kind of flags classes here that specify how many columns a certain field will occupy. Now, right now I have a 6-column grid, but obviously you can completely customize that to your own layout or your own needs. So let's go back to our app component configuration, and we now need to specify that container for a single row. And in Formly, we can basically create here a new so-called field group. And the field group groups basically many kind of Formly fields. And so we could say, for instance, the first name property as well as the age property here should go into a single row. And so we will move them into that field group. And now we know that that field group should have a certain class, which is that display flags. And so we can use the field group class name and add the display flags on top of that. Similarly, on our first name here, we can give it a class name. And we'll now apply those flags dash and number. So we could say that our first name should occupy like 3 columns, while, for instance, the age property down here should just occupy 1 column. And so that will be placed in 1 row. And we can continue like that as well here for the nation. So again, here we have our field group, we have our array, and we move the nation property and city ID up there. And we also need to give it again that field group class name, which is display flags. And then we have our final field, which will stay on a single row. And we just have 1 field, which is our IP address. And we can add here the class flag6, because this should basically expand to the entire row. Instead, here on our city ID, we can basically even it out. So we can say class name here should be flags3. And again, here also the nation ID should have the same class in flags3. And now let's move over to our form. And you can see how our form now lays out in multiple columns. For instance, here the first name takes up more columns. The age is a smaller one, and then these two are evenly distributed, and then we have a whole column again for the IP address. Of course, this is just a simple example, but you can see how you could customize that into a real-world layout. Now, one optimization I would definitely take here on this kind of configuration is to optimize that out, and that is a general suggestion. What we could do, for instance, here is we could create functions. I'm creating them here inside our app component, but definitely move them out into a separate file. So what we could say here is Formly row, and this is a function that takes a field configuration, and it will be an array because we want to pass in multiple fields. And what we want to optimize here or factor out is basically the creation of such a row definition. And so we could say here that we will return directly that field group configuration, and here we pass in the field config, which represents basically the series of fields that we want to configure. And with that, we can already optimize here that whole configuration part, because we could say here just formally row, and we pass in that array here. We can delete basically that part. And similarly, we can also refactor the rest. And finally, we have also formally row for our IP address. Let's check our form. Oh, we have a syntax error, so let's move up here. And we missed here the arrow function definition. And now if you check our form, it still works just as we expect. And you can see, however, how we basically reduce the amount of configuration we have to write. So when writing such a formally form, it can get quite huge, especially if you have a larger form, because there's a lot of details to write out and a lot of configurations and indentation that might also get a bit hard to read. Now, in some of our previous videos, we have already started to factor out some of the configuration in so-called reusable utility functions. For instance, here we have a so-called formally row, where we pass in a formally configuration, and we create the internal parts that formally requires, for instance, the definition of a class that we apply to each row in order to have a multi-column layout. Now, similarly, you can do that for the other form configurations as well. For instance, you could create a reusable function for all the input fields. And so we create here some formally input, which for now here, let's leave that empty. This returns a formally field config. And that's exactly what we're returning here. Now, as a first step, you can see here we have various fields that are for sure variable. For instance, the property binding will of course be variable. And so first of all, let's fix here our arrow function. We have different kind of types. So we have here the config that we pass in, and this will be a custom config type. So we will have definitely a key property to provide, and this is a string. We will also provide a label, which is also string. And then we might provide template options, which can be exactly to override the different kind of template options in our formally config. And so now we can start customizing that. For instance, the key here is the one we have in the config, so config.key. We definitely want to override here our label. So we have here the label property, which will be the config.label. And then we want to destructure here the config.template options that might have been provided from the outside. And so with that, we can go and, for instance, refactor out here our first name property. And we could here simply say formally input. We have the key first name, which remains the same. And we can give it a label, which is first name. And for the template options below here, we could actually specify them here and move them up. We don't need to specify the label anymore. And you can see how we start to reduce basically the amount of configuration we have to write. Now, this is just an example I'm writing out of my head right now, but this can be very customized to your own application. For instance, you could even create a whole configuration just for the nations, because they are represented always the same in your application. So what you could do here is to actually create a helper function, nation input, which gets here a configuration, and you just return basically the entire configuration of a nation. And so you can go down here, and instead of the nation specified like that, because you might have that in multiple places as well, you can just say formally nation input. So in the refactoring, we broke here our form. Let's have a look. Of course, we need the data service to be passed in, because our function doesn't know about the data service. So here we could either decide to either pass in the data service or directly basically the result of that data service. In this case, let's say we pass in this one. It is an observable of, let's say, any for now. And we reference these here as a data property. And now we obviously have to pass them in down here. But the goal here is to show you how you can reduce the formally configuration, because that might look always the same within your application. And also, in this case, for instance, the formally nation input is easily reusable across multiple forms inside your app. If you take a look at the formally configuration here, you can see that it's actually pretty simple. Like, we just have some kind of key value pairs here. They're some nested objects like for the template options, with maybe the exception here of maybe the on-init hooks, which are more like code-like. What I want to arrive at is that it's actually possible to deliver this whole configuration directly from the server. Now, this is a very specific case, but it might be useful in those cases where the user can somehow configure which fields should appear on the UI. And so let's see how to do that with Formly. First of all, let's go here in the assets folder and let's create here a new file, which we call dynamicform.json. Now, this will be the file that contains the actual response that usually then the server API would expose. But for the purpose of this demo here, we are just creating a static JSON file. And so the interesting part here is that we can actually go and copy over our whole configuration that we have inside here. So let's remove here the key because we don't need it right now. But then let me go ahead and copy the entire Formly configuration over to our dynamic form. The only thing we have to really remove here are a couple of things. So we have to remove here the hooks because that's something we actually cannot provide in JSON because we have some function expressions inside here and JSON doesn't support that. So I'll remove this for now. Also, what you see here is that we have some other function expressions here in the disable property as well as in the hide expression. Now, interestingly, these can directly be written also as string expressions, which is perfectly supported by Formly. And so we can just transform them. Now let's save here. Let's verify whether we have some other expressions here that don't match the JSON structure. For instance, this here, we cannot, of course, provide a data source because that won't be available. But given that we will deliver the values directly from the server, we will actually already pre-populate also the values of those options fields because it doesn't make any sense to do another call to the server for getting the data. So probably we would have here something like value null or label for deselecting the nation, and then let's just add one nation as an example, Italy. But obviously you would have here multiple nations inside here. Also, we need to remove here the comments because comments are not supported. So let's check whether we have some other comments inside here. Let's remove also the validators because it contains some function expressions. And now we should actually be good to go. You can see that Prettier automatically transformed the single quotes into double quotes, so we have a valid JSON structure. Now, in order to use that inside our component, let's first of all remove here that Formly config. And now we can go and dynamically fetch that JSON file. So of course I need here the HTTP service. So let me just quickly import that from HTTP common. And then on init, for instance, I can go and say this.http.get. And we will call here our assets dynamic form.json file. What we expect here is to be returned a Formly field config array. So we can already give that here. And then we can just subscribe for now here and we will get here the fields. And once we have the fields, we can actually associate them here to our fields, which is our local variable, which will then be taken over by Formly. And so now you can already see that we have already our form in place that is now dynamically constructed from that string that comes from the server. So obviously we are a bit limited in what we can express in a valid JSON, like function callbacks cannot be expressed really. But still, for instance, validations like here that min validation perfectly works. For instance, if I add here 16, you can see that the validator correctly triggers and the validation messages which we have registered on Formly will appear. Also, if we scroll down to the cities here, you can see here we have a couple of expression properties here, as well as a hide expression, and that also works. For instance, if I here deselect nation, you can see that the city field disappears, and so we can even implement some dynamic behavior based on other fields. What we have removed, however, is, for instance, on that city ID here, the onInit hook, which automatically listened to changes on the nation, and based on that nation filters basically the cities here. Now, this is something we will have to implement ourselves in some post-processing step, for instance. What you could do is when you get here the fields, you could actually go and search for the cities. And then on the server side, for instance, on that city here in the template options, you could add some property, for instance, something like dependent field. And let's say here, write nation ID. And so based on that, you could then in a post-processing step, which you perform here, attach an onInit hook and then register on the value changes of that dependent field that is specified here in the template options. There are a lot of possibilities which allow you to extend that furthermore, but that's really something specific to your use case. So in one of our previous videos, we have seen how to dynamically construct that formally field configuration out of a JSON file that we get from the server. So basically the server is able to expose our formally configuration, and that looks exactly like our formally configuration which we would type out ourselves. And so we can just fetch that and assign it then to our fields, which will then be rendered by formally. Another way of defining a server-side structure of a form can be via a JSON schema, and that's often facilitated by backend frameworks that have some utility functions already in place to generate JSON schemas out of an existing server-side form or some server-side data model structure. And so that's also why formally has support for JSON schema. Now let's have a look how that works. First of all, let's remove here the current format because JSON schema is a different one, and we start from an object. And usually that has a title. In this case, let's just add some title here in this form. This is not mandatory, and it can also vary a bit in how you expose your JSON schema on the server side. Now the type here is of type object because we have some nested properties here, and those are defined in that properties object here. And inside there, we can actually then lay out our actual fields. And so let's start with our first name, which is a simple one. And again, here we will have the type, and the type here is string. So here we describe basically the type of data that we expect to send back inside the JSON that contains this kind of key, this kind of property. And the title here is first name. So let's get started with this simple structure and map it onto our formally form. Now, if you go back here into our app component, we can obviously not keep this simple way of fetching the JSON from the server and then assigning it directly to our formally field config, because in this case here we won't get directly the formally field configuration, but rather the JSON schema field. So let's call it JSON schema here for now. So as a result, we need to map the JSON schema, and luckily formally already has a proper service for that. So let's import that. Let's call it formally JSON schema, and that's of type formally JSON schema, and we can import that directly from the formally core package. So from ngx formally core / JSON schema. Now let's import the formally JSON schema service. Now once we have that in place, we can actually go and map our JSON schema object here into a proper formally configuration. And so here we define the formally config, and we can say this dot formally JSON schema service dot to field config. And this expects here a JSON schema. Now for now, let's just log out the formally config to see what we get as a result. And if you open up here the console, let's scroll up a bit. And we can see here we get a type object, which then contains some various properties, like here the template options, which are Angular form label. We could use it actually as a title of our form if you want. But we are rather interested here in this field group, which then contains our actual values, our actual formally configuration that we want to map onto our form. And so inside here, we actually want to use that formally config dot field group and assign that to our fields. So far so good, but we see we still have an error here. And the error says that there is no type defined by the name string. And the problem here is that string is not a valid type for formally, because formally contains types such as input and so on. Now, obviously, if we can map this to input on the server side, this would work, and you can see that the field appears properly on our form. But usually, JSON schema is automatically converted in with types like string or number or these kind of information. And so we need to give formally a hint on how to interpret this kind of type. And we can do that by going to the app module here. And inside that types registration of that formally module registration here, we can define something like the following. So we can say whenever there is the type string, extend it from input. And so string will inherit all what has been defined for the type input. And this is a really handy way to define this and override or add additional types. And now you can see it works properly, just as we expect. Similarly, we can also map, for instance, another property like the nation ID, which is a bit more complex. And so the nation ID on the server side would be probably exposed by a type number. And again, the title here can be nation. Now again, let's save this. Probably we still get the same exception that number is not something that formally knows out of the box. exactly we get that same exception as we just got for type string. So we can go here and also define number. And we can say this extends from type input as well. But on the other side, this has also some defaults. For instance, a number has a template options type of number. In that case, we cannot enter any characters. And so we can say default options and then specify the template options just as we would manually define and say here type number. And so basically a number type that comes from the server extends input. So it basically inherits all of those properties. But we also want to immediately set the type number property on that input field. And so as a result, you can see here we get that number field here with the nation ID that comes from the server. We also get those arrows up and down, and we cannot type any kind of characters inside there. But on the other side, for the nation, we expect some drop-down field, right? And so in the JSON schema format, you're quite limited in what you can define. But there's a property called widget, which allows you to specify some UI type of information. And we are actually using that widget here, which is a free form field if you want, to define some formally config. And this formally config is read automatically by formally and then mapped onto the formally configuration. And so we can now specify here, for instance, the template options or the type which we want to have. For instance, here we could override the type number and say this should be a type select because we want to type select, so select box, a drop-down field in the end. And we also want some template options because we need to define the actual options that are defined inside our drop-down field. And so again, we have our usual values here. We could have null and then value 1 and label Italy. And so now we can see that we get the proper drop-down field just as we expect here. And you can see that the formally config is automatically read by formally when it parses that JSON schema, and then basically the content is mapped onto the corresponding formally field configuration, and it basically overrides everything that has been defined before here. And that allows us to specify additional types as well as additional template options and so on. If you want to additionally modify or customize how a certain JSON schema field here is interpreted by formally, you can go and add additional properties here in that toField config. And so as a second parameter, we can pass here in some options, and one of them is a map property. And that map here is actually a function that gives you the mapped field, which is the formally field configuration, which formally automatically extracted from that JSON schema entry, and also the original entry of that JSON schema. And based on that, you can actually continue and manipulate that map field and then return your actual formally field configuration that you want to have on your form. And so this is a really powerful mechanism for further implementing some custom behavior you might have in your specific application. For now, let's just undo this selection here again. Now we can also specify some additional information such as the required fields. It's just specified in a bit of a different syntax inside of a JSON schema. So what you have at the very bottom is a required property where you specify the IDs that are required. For instance, we can specify the first name. So if you save that, you can see that formally correctly identifies that required property. It sets the required validator onto that field, and so we get all of the validation that we usually have on our form. There are many more properties that formally supports and many more properties that you can specify in a JSON schema. So definitely go and check out the specs and the source code inside formally.